In the middle of the 1970s, the capital of Zaire looked, from a distance, like the future. Kinshasa's broad Boulevard du Trente Juin, named for the country's Independence Day, ran straight to the river. Light fell across it the way light falls across the Champs-Élysées in postcards, only hotter and with deeper red dust. Joseph Desiré Mobutu, who had renamed himself Mobutu Seko Kuku Nji Bendu Benga, the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to succeed, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake, had been in power for a decade. He had been handed Zaire by the United States, Belgium, and a Cold War logic that needed a friendly flag in the heart of Africa. He had survived 2 invasions in 2 years, French paratroopers dropping into Kolwezi in 1978. He had renamed the Congo. He had replaced Western suits with his famous leopardskin cap and a walking stick carved from a single piece of ivory. Foreign correspondents filed 1,000 words about his authenticity program, about nationalization, about the new Africa Mobutu was supposedly inventing. They usually filed from Paris. Inside the country, the regime's scriptwriters called the era recurs, the return. To diplomats in Washington and Brussels, Zaire was the cornerstone of a continent. To the copper traders in London, it was an open pit you could drain. The CIA liked Mobutu because he had been useful against Angola. The IMF liked him more quietly because he was in hoc. 6 years later, in the spring of 1978, a thin, white-haired German banker was sitting in a sun-bleached office on the 4th floor of the Banque du Zaire, surrounded by accounting ledgers the Mobutu regime had spent a decade trying to hide. His name was Erwin Blumenthal. He had been the youngest-ever director of the Bundesbank's foreign division. The IMF had flown him to Kinshasa as part of a stabilization deal to do something no one inside Zaire was allowed to do, which was to look closely at where the money actually went. He would later write in a confidential report, "Any attempt to establish a more strict control of the budget is bound to fail because of one major obstacle, the presidency." In this office, no distinction is made between state expenditures and personal needs. What makes a document like that, 50 pages, addressed to no one official, signed by a man who had hoped to fix things, worth 3 decades of explanation? Let's start with the copper. Zaire, the country that became the Democratic Republic of the Congo, sat on what was once called the Copper Belt, one of the richest deposits of copper and cobalt on Earth. In the early 1970s, copper prices spiked. GECAMINES, the state mining company, brought in close to $500 million a year. Then the price collapsed. By 1975, the price was down more than 40%. The same year, Zaire could not service its external debt, a phrase governments use, meaning it could not pay what it owed to foreigners. GDP, which had been growing in real terms, contracted. By 1976, the economy was, in the dry language of an IMF report, unable to service its debt. Private investment had collapsed to roughly 6 or 7% of GDP. According to the World Bank, between 1975 and 1978 alone, Zaire's GDP actually shrank. This is where the money had to come from somewhere. It came from creditors. Between 1970 and 1994, according to a 1997 Financial Times investigation later cited by the Los Angeles Times, Zaire received roughly $8.5 billion in loans and grants from Western donors. The United States, France, Belgium, the United Kingdom, the World Bank, the IMF, and a long list of commercial banks. Multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank provided the seal of legitimacy. The commercial banks followed. By the end of his rule, Mobutu had accumulated on his country's books a public external debt of roughly $14 billion, according to the economists Léonce Ndikumana and James K. Boyce at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, writing in 1998. That is roughly $1,500 for every citizen of a country where average annual income by the late 1980s was below $200. Debt service interest payments alone would consume close to a third of the country's export earnings. The numbers on the other side of the ledger are worse. In the same Ndikumana and Boyce study, capital flight, money removed from the country by the political and economic elite, was, in real terms, between 1968 and 1990, around $12 billion. With imputed interest, it approached $18 billion. The country borrowed $14 billion and watched almost as much leave. Stephen Askin and Carol Collins, 2 American researchers who studied the regime in detail in the early 1990s, documented that presidential appropriations officially consumed 15 to 20% of the government's operating budget and 30 to 50% of the capital budget. In 1978, GECAMINES was instructed to deposit its entire export earnings, which by 1989 had reached $1,200 million in a single year, into a special presidential account at the central bank. The IMF saw most of this up close. In 1981, it provided Zaire with what was, at that point, the largest loan the fund had ever made to an African country, over $1 billion in special drawing rights, according to IMF annual reports and the historians who later chronicled the program. In 1987, the fund approved another loan under pressure from the United States government, over the explicit objections of senior staff members. The Zimbabwean-born former director of the IMF's Trade and Finance Department, C. D. Finch, would write in 1988 that balance of payments assistance was in danger of becoming indistinguishable from political support. He meant Cold War political support. He meant Angola. The real-time drama did not require archival sleuthing to understand. Zaire's mineral revenues, diamonds rooted in some cases to South Africa in defiance of the continental boycott. Cobalt sold to American and Belgian buyers at administered prices. Copper sold on world markets were filtered through a series of Treasury special accounts that answered to the presidency. Citing Blumenthal's later report, Ndikumana-Boyce note that between 1976 and 1978 alone, 400 million Belgian francs were withdrawn from these special accounts through paper checks, one of which was paid in the amount of 60 million francs to one of Mobutu's European architects. In 1981, the central bank transferred $30 million to Mobutu's personal account abroad. José Mutombo-Katie, a representative of the rebel movement that eventually overthrew Mobutu, told Swiss investigators that the president could pick up a phone and have the Central Bank of Zaire deliver, within hours, $500,000 in cash. Nguza Carly-Bond, a former prime minister of Zaire who broke with Mobutu in the late 1970s, believed the president had personally amassed $4 billion by the late 1970s, a figure U.S. officials in Washington would later put at $3 to $5 billion at the regime's peak. Erwin Blumenthal was not, in retrospect, the kind of man one would choose to lose. He had been born in 1914 in a small German town. He had joined the Bundesbank in its founding years. He had risen by his mid-50s to become its youngest-ever director of foreign operations. He had helped rebuild the Deutschmark after the war. He had negotiated on the floor of the Smithsonian in 1971. He had, in short, spent his working life inside the machinery of post-war finance, the European recovery, the gold pool, the introduction of flexible exchange rates. In 1977, by then in his early 60s and officially retired, Blumenthal took a consultancy at the European American Bank in New York, then moved into a senior advisory role at the fund. When the IMF agreed to a stabilization program with Zaire in late 1976, it sent a multinational team to Kinshasa to audit and reform the central bank. Blumenthal was its senior figure from 1977 to 1979, the international civil servant who became, almost against his wishes, the institutional memory of how the Mobutu regime actually worked. He arrived with colleagues. He left, eventually, with a confidential 50-page report that would, within 4 years of his resignation, be leaked to the Christian Science Monitor and to Belgian papers. In its blunt language it included the words, "There is no, I repeat no, chance on the horizon for Zaire's numerous creditors to get their money back. There has been and remains only one major obstacle to annihilate such prospects, the corruption of the team in power." Michel Arong, the British journalist who would later write the definitive book-length account of the regime, described him much later as a man who could have been the last, best chance for Zaire. He had been. What happened inside the Banque du Zaire is in some ways more important than what the report later said. Blumenthal's team, when they arrived, found that the central bank's accounting was not really accounting, it was a permission slip. The president's office issued instructions on what should be paid out, and check balances were kept on slips of paper in a separate drawer. Special accounts, opened in the name of treasury functions that did not actually exist, moved money outward to commercial banks in Brussels, Geneva, and Paris, where Mobutu's relatives had personal accounts. Blumenthal, in interviews with Euromoney in early 1979, acknowledged special connections between groups with political muscle, and he said, in his affable way, "We have to force the commercial banks to follow the rules now. We have got to establish law and order in the whole system." Behind the formal deal, an internal struggle went on for at least 2 years. Blumenthal would later tell colleagues that he had presented clear evidence to the fund's senior staff in Washington that the presidential special accounts were being emptied. He was told on at least one occasion by a senior mission chief that the fund's mandate in Kinshasa was to keep Zaire solvent enough to keep paying interest to commercial creditors, not to embarrass the host. By mid-1978, Blumenthal had stopped believing the program could be saved. 2 commercial banks, Citibank and Bank of America, refused even to send representatives to a meeting Blumenthal had called in New York to discuss what their correspondent branches in Kinshasa had been doing. They knew, he later concluded, they had known the whole time. To understand why the IMF kept lending, you have to follow a second story on another continent in another capital. The United States since 1960 had regarded the Congo as a hinge. Patrice Lumumba, the first elected prime minister, had been killed with CIA involvement. Mobutu had been installed as a Cold War counterweight. Through Angola, increasingly, the hinge was tested. After 1975, when Cuban troops and the MPLA took Luanda, the white-ruled regime in South Africa and the United States both saw Southern Africa as a place where a single communist foothold could become many. They needed a base. Zaire, conveniently, was that base. The Shaba provinces, the old Katanga, ran along the Angolan border. From there, the CIA in the late 1970s and 1980s ran a covert war against the Angolan government, funding UNITA, the rebel movement, and channeling money through South Africa. Mobutu, in his own words, cooperated. U.S. intelligence officials later admitted, and former CIA officers confirmed in interviews with the Los Angeles Times, that Washington made covert multi-million-dollar payments to Mobutu specifically to fund these operations. The officials also said the money never went where it was supposed to go. It went, mostly, to Mobutu. The 1977 and 1978 invasions of Shaba by Katangan exiles, rebels based in Angola, were the visible price the regime paid for being a hinge. In 1977, Mobutu called for help. In 1978, French and Belgian paratroopers parachuted into Kolwezi to retake the provincial capital. According to the military historian Thomas Odom, writing in his study of the intervention, the operation was a museum of competing agendas. The French wanted to reassert a colonial-era relationship, the Belgians wanted to protect their mining interests, the Americans wanted to demonstrate to Moscow that the West would not permit attrition of a friendly government in Central Africa. The IMF, by 1978, was also in the room. When the fund approved loans in 1981, 1983, and 1987, one factor, never the only factor, but a factor, was the judgment in Western capitals that denying Zaire balance of payments support, while it was being used as a launchpad for covert operations against Angola, would be self-defeating. Blumenthal knew this. The senior staff at the IMF who read his reports knew this. They kept lending. And here is the contradiction that makes the entire story obscene rather than merely tragic. The IMF's Articles of Agreement, the document signed in 1944 at Bretton Woods, explicitly restrict the use of fund resources to current balance of payments needs and explicitly require adequate safeguards to ensure the resources are used for their stated purpose. The fund's own staff in Washington, reading Blumenthal's reports from 1977 onward, knew that the multi-billion-dollar loans were being skimmed at the Treasury. They had the bank statements. They had the document Blumenthal eventually filed. They kept lending. The contradiction sharpens if we look at 1987. In that year, the fund approved a new loan to Zaire under direct pressure from the United States, despite strong objections from senior staff members. At the same moment, Mobutu was allowing the United States to use Zairean territory as a base from which to fund UNITA's war against the Angolan government. CD. Finch, the former director of the IMF's Trade and Finance Department, captured the moment best when he wrote that the intrusion of political factors into the fund's decision-making had made balance of payments assistance indistinguishable from political support. That sentence is, depending on your reading, either a confession or an indictment. And there is the deeper contradiction, the one Blumenthal's resignation foreshadowed. The institution that was supposed to teach Zaire fiscal discipline was, by its own accounting, financing the dissolution of fiscal discipline. The fund stabilization programs in Zaire, at least 4 by 1982, by the World Bank's count, were repeated violations of the same conditionality that was being imposed on poorer borrowers in West Africa and Latin America, where a missed inflation target could break a program. But Zaire was not a poor borrower to be taught, it was a strategic borrower to be kept. It would have been, for the fund's communicative apparatus, almost easier if Mobutu had been a competent kleptocrat. If he had been competent, the IMF would have had to admit what was happening. If he had been incompetent, they could have walked away. He was both, and so they kept lending anyway. What the country cost in money is, in the end, easier to count than what it cost in lives. The public external debt of roughly $14 billion was, after Mobutu fell in 1997, inherited by the new government of Laurent Desire Kabila. Some of it was eventually cancelled as odious debt, some was simply not paid, some has been restructured again in successive rounds between the IMF and the Congolese government. According to a preliminary estimate cited by the Los Angeles Times in 1997, Zaire still owed the United States alone $1.5 billion in unpaid loans at the moment Mobutu fell. The personal side of the ledger is harder. By 1997, U.S. officials in Washington estimated Mobutu's personal wealth at $3 to $5 billion, but added that it had probably peaked a decade earlier and shrunk as he fought to stay in power. The Financial Times, in a 1997 investigation, documented at least 20 properties in Belgium, Switzerland, France, Portugal, Morocco, Brazil, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Spain, with a combined minimum assessed value of $37 million, much of it held through front companies. 11 palaces inside Zaire itself, a private gold mine said to hold 100 tons over 32,000 square miles. A chateau in southern Portugal with a wine cellar said to hold 14,000 bottles. The Swiss froze one of his villas near Lausanne, valued at $2.75 million, but acknowledged they could not touch bank assets they could not locate, in accounts they believed might still total $4 billion. Most of the rest has never been recovered. When he left Kinshasa in May 1997, his presidential jet carried him to Rabat, where 4 months later, dying of prostate cancer, he died in a modest house, as if to prove that nothing in this story could escape irony. What he left behind was a country. The First Congo War, beginning in October 1996 and ending with Mobutu's fall, killed perhaps tens of thousands directly and displaced more than 1 million. The Second Congo War, beginning in August 1998, drew in 9 African nations and became, by some counts, the deadliest conflict since the Second World War, between 5 and 6 million dead, by the International Rescue Committee's most cited estimate by 2008. The infrastructure of GECAMINES, which had once produced over 500,000 tons of copper a year at its 1986 peak, collapsed to 48,000 tons by the late 1990s. Cobalt and diamond production fell in similar proportions. The roads the Belgian state had built were unmaintained, the railways had rusted, the universities had emptied. By 2001, the year Mobutu's successor was assassinated in his own presidential palace, average life expectancy in the Democratic Republic of the Congo had fallen below what it had been at independence in 1960. The IMF stabilization programs, which had been the ostensible justification for the lending, did not survive the regime they had financed. I want to be careful here, because this story invites a kind of moral simplicity it does not deserve. There is a temptation, and some commentators have given in to it, to turn Mobutu into a single villain and the IMF into a single accomplice, and to say the regime was simply a dictator stealing from his people. That is partly true, and it is not enough. Mobutu was installed in a coup by the United States and Belgium in 1965. He was useful to France. He was inherited from a colonial extraction system that had built an economy to ship copper, cobalt, and diamonds out, and was not designed to leave much behind. The post-1945 Belgian state had built its prosperity on the back of the mixed Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, in which Mobutu would later take an unaccounted equity stake. The multinational mining houses, American, Belgian, French, British, continued to do business with him well after the plunder was documented. Askin and Collins, the American researchers, made clear that the corruption involved hundreds of officials, not one. Belgian prime ministers received payments tied to Mobutu. Senior Belgian civil servants were named in Blumenthal's leaked report. The IMF was not the only institution that knew what was happening. Commercial banks holding correspondent relationships with the central bank knew too. To blame one institution or one man is to mistake a continent's tragedy for a single act of theft. The story is more useful and truer told the longer way. The story here is not really about Zaire. It is about what happens when an international institution decides that stability, in the sense of keeping a regime in hoc to its solvent, matters more than the institutional principle it is supposed to enforce. It is what happens when the language of fiscal discipline becomes, in private, the language of strategic alliance. The IMF did not, in 1977 or 1981 or 1987, secretly fund a thief. It openly funded a thief whose thievery helped him hold a country that was strategically useful to a Cold War patron. It is the most useful possible description of what the bailout reflex becomes in practice. Not the rescue of an economy, but the underwriting of a political choice. C.D. Finch was right. The fund's assistance was in danger of becoming indistinguishable from political support. The lesson is not new. It is older than Bretton Woods. It is the lesson that whoever sets the conditions for credit tends also to shape the politics of the borrower, and that the visible terms of the loan are never a reliable guide to the invisible ones. Maybe the deepest version is the most uncomfortable. Documents like the credit agreement between the IMF and Zaire are intended to be boring. They are written for civil servants in a code meant to be illegible to almost everyone. The conditions, interest, conditionality, performance criteria are the kind of thing only specialists reread. Inscribed on the world's most boring documents, though, are the world's most consequential decisions. That is what Blumenthal was trying to say. It is what we forget every decade or so at enormous cost. If this kind of careful archival work on the institutions behind power is useful to you, leave the word BLUMENTHAL in the comments. I'd like to know what other institutions you want traced. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. We go slow on these stories because some of them only make sense when you refuse to.